Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we've got another compiled episode of, honestly, a lot of projects that didn't get a ton of attention, except for a couple that are, well, you'll know them when you hear them. But again, it's going to be a little bit scattered for the next couple of weeks, as August and September looks to be really damn busy. We'll see what happens there, but enough wasting time. Let's get on the pulse. Now, before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Again, hope to get some of these shared around, so drop comments, please be sure to share. These sort of compilation episodes, it's a little bit tough to say how much they get shared with some of the bigger names. You'd like to think it'd get more visibility, but who the hell knows. But now onto the matter at hand. We got 8 projects on the docket. Let's start off with, from Fen, Monuments to Absence. This has been one of my most anticipated black metal releases in 2023, as a textural experience in terms of shredding, poetry, and sheer progressive immensity. There's a richness to Fen that I've liked for years, especially on 2017's Winter. And while their 2019 album, The Deadlight, felt a little overly clean for my taste, it was still a great listen, and the buzz was suggesting that this new project was set to return to a nastier, crushing tone. And yeah, it certainly does. But it might feel like a slight overcorrection, going even further towards death and even thrash metal, while still maintaining that cleaner production style, especially around the drums that I still don't really love, especially as this album returns to a longer runtime and the dynamics feel a bit more subdued, especially in the transitions and looking for melodies that would really catch my ear. Now, the poetry is still visceral and potent. It's an anti-religion screed, but I like how it exposes not just a sadomasochistic fervor in that belief itself, but how all the monuments to higher powers can feel when there's nothing really behind them. When the vainglorious conviction confronts the bleak emptiness at the very end, that feels like a thematic culmination between both Winter and The Deadlight, with some truly graphic imagery. And you know what, for what it's worth, I love how Fen can still assemble these terrific seething grooves, and the majority of these songs have moments that'll really grab you, like the slow, simmering build of the title track with the great bass lines all the way through, to the progressive ebb and furious return of To Silence and Abyss We Reach, from the haunted, simmering waves of Truth is Futility, to perhaps the most melodically robust song on the project with Wracked, and the excellent slow crescendo of All Is Lost. But at the same time, I wish this project felt a bit more memorable for more than just the sheer pummeling excess and exquisite agony. And as much as it was mostly texturally sound, the full runtime can make this kind of draining. It's absolutely really damn good, at many points on the cusp of greatness, just not sure it gets all the way there. All I'm saying. From MisterWives, Nosebleeds. I can't be the only one who feels like MisterWives got screwed with their last album, Super Bloom. They got signed to a bigger label for an elaborately staged breakup album coming after 2 highly underrated indie pop projects in the 2010s. Surely this would be it! Except that label was fueled by ramen, and the year was 2020, and MisterWives saw their personality thoroughly mismanaged for a tepid album that didn't even perform, and saw them get dumped by the label a year later. And you could tell from the singles they were coming back angry on this project, with a lot of pent-up emotions they needed to process, and my god, they certainly do, as this album starts off with percussive dance punk rage, and then takes its time to open up into a sharper, more refined and polished brand of synth-heavy new wave that they were touching on with Super Bloom, but this feels considerably sharper, groovier, more focused and vibrant. There's this swaggering energy, color, and some actual urgency that might not match their earliest albums, mostly because all the flashy horns are nearly gone, and there's less of that vibrant vocal multi-tracking, but MisterWives also seem to know it's going to be kind of a struggle to recapture some of that youth and unique spirit, and this album kind of is the journey to get them back there. And from that point, well, MisterWives, they've never really been the deepest band in the world, and that's kind of true with a couple songs on the back half here on their winding journey of recovery that can feel a little bit flimsy. But there are quite a few observations I actually like in capturing the frustration of indecisive paralysis, the feeling of getting boxed in while you are told you're at your greatest heights, where you might even actually appreciate some of the pain because at least it's not numbness, and then giving yourself the space and grace to stumble hard and regress when societal routines of self-care, they don't really get to the roots of your problems, or if you're tempted back into making those same mistakes again. But ultimately, what we have here is a pretty punchy, high-energy indie pop and new wave album with enough flair and groove to stay pretty catchy, and more edge to pump up some accessible melodic texture that maybe could afford a little bit more variety. It's probably their most rock-friendly release, even if I would struggle to call it precisely great. MisterWives, they don't always modulate their albums as well as they should. It could have afforded a few moments to slow down, and the heavily processed 80s new wave textures, they can start running together. It's a pretty familiar sound. Still, I would call this a really nice return to form. It's a pretty fun project. Give it a shot. Check it out. From Angel Electronics, Ultra Paradise. Yeah, I know, I should have covered this 6 months ago. Probably would have in that week in February when I went on vacation and fell behind on pretty much everything. But I did finally get to this manic collab debut between Ada Rook of Black Dresses and Ash Nerve. This demented fusion of happy hardcore, grindcore, and pop punk. And upon a bunch of re-listens, I think I figured out why this has been so frustrating over the months here. For as much as I can appreciate the dense cacophony of chugging riffs and tremolo shredding, and surprisingly tight bass work that's still somehow wildly catchy, the mix balance is kind of wonky in an actively distracting way, especially around the vocals, where it never seems like that melody has quite enough room to breathe. Now, part of this is that in terms of clean singing, neither Ada Rook nor Ash Nerve have particularly strong voices, but they're also not placed above the Tempest enough to accentuate what they do have, and given the whole frenzied energy, it can come across like trying to mask deficiencies rather than amplify any of their strengths. And that's kind of a shame because there are tangible strengths here, with the irrepressibly chipper energy and a remarkable amount of imagination and genre bending. The glittery synths on the dance punk 1001 Nights, the quaking breakdowns that come through on Angel, the gentle sapphic bounce that can still unleash a pretty sweet guitar solo and a tempo ramp up on Party Girl, and the utterly wild guitar work on Hide and Sew. Although I'm not sure they quite pulled off the groove switch-ups on Evil Behind You, or some of the metallic pop trap of Return to the Sky. And you know, while we are here, the lyrics, they have this hyper-caffeinated, borderline fantasy camp and the love-struck yearning that eventually I did find charming, but by the end it feels a little like a Caro Bonito-esque forced smile put over the nightmarish darkness that is just out of frame, which does have the project end on a rather downbeat note that felt a little off to me. Overall, I am happy I finally got to this. It's certainly a fun romp, but I think the potential is what's going to pull me back going forward. It's good stuff, worth hearing. Check it out. From the Raven Age, Blood Omen. Look, I had every reason to ignore this. Between the nepotism and bog-standard melodic metalcore imitation on Conspiracy back in 2019, I was thoroughly unimpressed by what seemed like a band coasting on a name and a couple good tunes and anything that lasted. So I figured I'd give this one a quick listen, probably veto it, and thus color me shocked when I wound up mostly enjoying it. Now, granted, it's come from them pivoting into something that's much closer to modern melodic power metal with some alt metal chugging, cleaner vocals, much brighter melodies, more bombast, stronger hooks, a few shockingly good bass lines. I'm not sure the genre shift wins them any more dignity, but the songs popped enough to make me go back to Conspiracy and check that I wasn't missing something, and I wasn't, but no, this is a major shift that's finally playing to this band's strengths. Who am I about to complain about that? Now, granted, moving into a subgenre that I like more doesn't really take away from the Raven Age's other issues. The writing feels very broadly sketched in all the allusions to cycles of history, false prophets and deceivers, overcoming great trials, a song written from Lucifer's point of view, pretty bog standard for this brand of metal. And let's be real, this is not like it's doing anything exceptional or revolutionary in its new subgenre either. In particular, the drums feel pretty stock, even underpowered. If anything, if it wasn't for the Raven Age's connections or increasingly accessible sound, they probably would not have the buzz that they do in the mainstream, even with the sound that plays more to their strengths. I mean, this might be more to my taste, but I'm not sure exactly how special it is. That being said, there are a couple songs I might revisit, and it's a easy, surprisingly quick listen. If you're in the market for this sound and a few songs that feel catchier than your average melodic power metal band, you can do a lot worse than this, so yeah, with that, give it a shot. From Lori McKenna, 1988. The slightly exasperating thing about Lori McKenna albums is that as I get older, they only seem to get better. Her weathered vocals, Dave Cobb's production on the recent projects, the musings on, well, getting older and motherhood that pick up so much texture and resonance and wisdom. It's why, even if I thought 2020's The Balladeer was slightly weaker than the absolutely superb The Bird and the Rifle from 2016 or The Tree from 2018, it was still one of the best albums of that year. And for these 10 songs, hell, there's more twang, energy, and spark that leans towards folk and southern rock than I've heard from her in a while, since probably Lorraine about a decade ago. There's actually even some fuzz guitar on The Town in Your Heart, and it's one of her most borderline anthemic moments in the closer, The Tunnel. Yeah, it's still a little overly dry in its mixing, and the live recording with the reverb can feel a little bit gratuitous, but hey, at least Dave Cobb gives the bass lines a little bit more room to breathe for a little bit more foundation. But again, Lori McKenna albums are make or break on the songwriting. And here, I think it's two sides of the coin. The gratitude and security that comes with stability and a strong family. And while there are a couple exasperated moments, Killing Me with Hillary Lindsey is a standout for those who are selfishly focusing on negativity, she ultimately will be able to get through them. But then comes the other half of the album, with the predominant focus on those who weren't exactly so lucky, be they through troubled family situations, drug abuse, poverty, or those who just couldn't settle down. And it's kind of heartbreaking how much Lori McKenna cares and recognizes that even though she can't save them, it feels like she's still letting them down even as she tries, even if she ends on the project still being mostly hopeful. Now, this does mean the album starts off oddly slow. The back half is considerably stronger in terms of the content, the melodies, and the groove. And you know what? I would struggle to say that this project has the unique soul-wrecking presence of her absolute best. Lori McKenna's themes are pretty well worn now. You know what you're expecting. And while this is certainly comfortable, the stakes mostly being outside of herself in many of these stories can feel a little bit distancing. But again, I'm nitpicking one of the best singer-songwriters who are working today. This is still a great album and a step up from The Balladeer, and another excellent entry in a banner year for country music. Y'all are out of excuses. Check this out. From Disclosure, Alchemy. I've been on the record not being the biggest fan of Disclosure. Even Settle is a more uneven album than I think many remember. But I realized after covering Energy in the middle of the summer of 2020 that maybe I didn't need Disclosure to be all that consistent so long as their sharpest bangers really popped off. So I was actually quite intrigued to check out this surprise album that dropped from out of nowhere with no name guest stars or features that tilts even further towards UK garage, a little bit more genre bending. And yet I gotta be honest, this is probably their most consistent album in terms of vibe and flow, but also one I don't really find that interesting. A lot of this project once again feels very indebted to previous electronic sounds and house and breakbeat and acid house that already had a lot of runway in the 90s and 2000s, but this time targeting the less abrasive and immediate sides of those subgenres, swapping out their biggest swings for something that's a little bit more measured and tasteful, a deliberate narrowing of their scope. And you know, that can work. Based on some of the ambient sound effects that pepper the album, it's got the feel of going out by yourself to a smaller underground club that would not play the hits, instead opting for something smaller scale, more for the purist and the house aficionados than a stadium or a festival. But you'd also think there'd be a slightly more communal vibe or something a bit more genre bending or experimental, and there isn't really that much of either here. It's certainly an easy listen. It runs under 40 minutes, and while of course the momentum flags in the back half, that's been an issue with Disclosure their entire careers, and even then it's still relatively even in quality, but it's not exactly memorable in a lot of its melodies. I remember a lot more of the whip-sharp percussion texture that's been Disclosure's hallmark, rather than any tune or vocal line that really pops off. Again, I've always been on the outside looking in with Disclosure. Maybe 4 albums in, they're just never going to be my thing. Even if there are a couple nice songs here, it's kind of fitting that they call this project Alchemy, because for those for whom this works, it's gonna be a subtle bit of magic, but everyone else will either just dismiss it or forget it outright. And I'm probably in the latter category. Just didn't do much for me. From Rae Jepsen, The Loveliest Time. Alright, look, I really like Rae Jepsen. She makes impeccably crisp and focused pop music with a usually pretty well-produced throwback sheen, but with last year's The Loneliest Time, which had great moments and expanded her sound, but never stuck as much as I wanted, I couldn't escape the impression that she may have a ceiling, the further she strays away from the huge synth-pop bangers, the most soft-spoken, love-struck yearning of her most delicate ballads. And the more listens I give to this, the more true that feels, as this is probably the least I've liked a Rae Jepsen project in some time. And I wish it was just one thing that felt kind of awry, but Rae Jepsen playing to a gauzier, new disco brand of chic and tighter cool, it requires a brand of detachment that I don't think she commands effectively, especially when the softer melodies are downplayed in favor of grooves that feel increasingly lockstep and electronic, built more for dance floor vamping and fewer hooks. And you know what, even that could have worked, but so many of these cuts feel framed to be so much more sultry and small scale, but not exactly create a lot of intimacy, hitting a generally pleasant but not transcendent middle ground. Made all the more exasperating because she's flitting across a number of different styles within that sound that also don't really play to her strengths, or really push any significant boundaries within those spaces and subgenres. And when you factor in her writing playing to her usual standbys in terms of the yearning love songs, it leads to an odd discordant feeling that I couldn't shake. She's trying to be a shapeshifter across pop, but when your most effective range is so strong, so transcendent, this feels like less than the sum of its parts. Now, that's not saying this is bad at all. It's very breezy, very listenable. For the most part, it's very well produced, and there's a couple of moments that I genuinely really like, such as the terrific bass line of So Right, the pulsating blast of Kamikaze, the fluttery swell of Psychedelic Switch, the flare of the strings opposite the icy synths and borderline IDM percussion of After Last Night, which is later echoed in some striking drum work on Put It to Rest. Then you have the coursing coo for the Wallflowers in the lead-off single Shy Boy, and then probably the most striking bit of slow burn introspection on Collage, and probably the closest thing to her old synth-pop bangers on Stadium Love. And again, that's a lot of songs. But for as much as there is this running joke that Rae Jepsen's B-sides are better than her albums, this is the first project that emphatically feels like lesser cuts to me. It's still good, it's still worth hearing, but I don't know, she's capable of greatness. From Travis Scott, Utopia. So I think I've got a theory why Travis Scott hasn't really been able to escape the lingering shadow of the crowd crush nightmare back in 2021. Because if you look at everything he's said, even in his art for nearly the past decade, he's a cipher. A shallow hedonist who built a temple to his swampy rage and dares you to get lost in it like he did. Where he's at is probably his most interesting as a collaborator, providing a backdrop to other artists. It's why I was, and still mostly am, underwhelmed by Astroworld, a carnival with so little substance to support it and is not exactly aged well, and why the majority of his guest verses are utterly vacuous and unmemorable, and why I've never really bought into the ongoing hype around Utopia for the past 5 years, or if it would ever even come. But hey, it actually is here, with a runtime of 73 minutes. And you know, this might be contentious, but here it goes. I think I get what Travis Scott was attempting thematically, especially with how much this album borrows from Kanye West and specifically Yeezus, and the warped blur of progressive rock samples and electronic percussive rage. We're embracing even more over-the-top genre-blending production. He just owns it all to blow through even more debauchery, eventually forgiving himself to find his own personal transcendent utopia in his mind on the other side. Now I could highlight that Mike Dean is the consistent element across all of these attempted, overdone attempts to rip off the Money Store 10 years late, but really the gaping issue is that Travis Scott's contorted performances and awkward ad-libs, they don't really match Kanye's thrashing intensity or imagination, especially on an album that's way too goddamn long with even less to say, and minus any of the charged lyrical transgressions on Yeezus, or any sense that tangible consequences have been felt emotionally, because Travis does not have Kanye's old record for introspection in bars. We got an album that gestures at having edges or thoughtfulness, but just cannot back any of it up, and he sacrificed so much of his old school, smoked out Houston Houston's southern flair to do so. And all that runs at odds with the album's other obvious goal of getting big commercial attention through some name chasing, which lacks a lot of impact when it's very obvious which guests were phoning it in, or if the song might have just been rejected from their own albums. Looking right at Beyonce and Young Thug here. Alongside a truly abysmal Playboi Carti performance, the abortive fragments that we got from Young Lean, Sway Lee, and Sampha, and then Drake trying to recapture the dis-energy that came on Sicko Mode on Meltdown, and failing miserably to convey any sense of menace. Now that's not saying there aren't moments here. The production and sample choices can occasionally produce a pretty impressive soundscape, even if it is nowhere near as experimental or bombastic as Travis clearly thinks it is, and the hooks are relatively few and far between. And then Westside Gunn has some restless energy on Lost Forever. Rob 49, 21 Savage, and SZA, they bring their own brands of menace. Future actually tries to be a little bit more introspective. James Blake and Justin Vernon, they've got some relatively uncanny, even gorgeous vibes in some of their crooning. And despite the pretty rough hook, I actually like Kid Cudi on Love, might be my favorite song here. But to be a little transgressive here, Utopia feels like a mid-2010s DC blockbuster movie, where every studio note adds in more bloat and takes away from a weak, nihilistic story, where the heroes are reassured that they don't owe the world a thing, and we are simply to be in awe of the presence. Minus all the smoke, I'm no longer mesmerized. Now, once again, thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Give you a little bit of an update of what's going to be happening. I'm going to be at Osheaga, the music festival in Montreal, over this upcoming weekend, so you might see a little less content. Actually, depending on when this goes live, I might be at Osheaga as we speak, so you'll have to wait and find out about that. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule in the meantime, because I am still going to be listening to other music, or you guys want to support the channel, or just argue with me more directly on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. As always, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.